The rain hammered against the embassy windows as Marcus Chen adjusted his earpiece for the third time that evening. As head of the diplomatic security team, he had overseen hundreds of missions, but something felt different about tonight. The intelligence reports were scattered, the local contacts were nervous, and the ambassador's schedule had been changed twice in the last hour. Ambassador Sarah Mitchell was scheduled to meet with rebel leaders in a neutral zone just outside the capital city. The peace talks had been months in the making, and failure tonight could mean the end of negotiations that might prevent a civil war. Marcus watched through the bulletproof glass as his advance team took their positions around the meeting location, a small restaurant that had been cleared for the evening. The ambassador's convoy consisted of 3 armored vehicles, each carrying trained security personnel. Marcus rode in the lead vehicle, constantly scanning the streets for any signs of trouble. The city had been relatively quiet for weeks, but intelligence suggested that extremist groups opposed to peace talks were planning something big. As they approached the meeting point, Marcus noticed unusual activity. Street vendors who should have been packing up for the night were still present. A few cars were parked in positions that hadn't been there during his earlier reconnaissance. His gut instinct screamed danger, but the mission was too important to abort based on suspicion alone. Inside the restaurant, Ambassador Mitchell began her preliminary discussions with the rebel representatives. The talks were delicate, requiring careful navigation of years of mistrust and violence. Every word mattered. Every gesture could be interpreted as either progress or provocation. Marcus positioned himself near the main entrance, his team covering all other exits and approaches. The first sign of real trouble came from his communications officer. Radio chatter indicated unusual military movement in the surrounding blocks. Government forces that were supposed to remain distant were slowly encircling the area. This wasn't part of the agreed security arrangement, and it made the rebel representatives increasingly nervous. Marcus tried to maintain calm while assessing the situation. The ambassador was deep in crucial negotiations, having just achieved a breakthrough on prisoner exchanges. Walking away now could destroy months of diplomatic work, but staying might put everyone in immediate danger. The restaurant's atmosphere grew tense as both sides noticed the changing dynamics outside. Rebel security started positioning themselves more defensively, while Marcus's team reported government checkpoints appearing on all major exit routes. What had been planned as a secure, neutral meeting was rapidly becoming a trap with all parties inside. Ambassador Mitchell, experienced in crisis situations, continued her discussions while subtly signaling to Marcus that she was aware of the developing situation. The rebel leaders were becoming increasingly agitated, some suggesting the meeting was a setup designed to capture their leadership in one location. As Marcus coordinated with his team to develop contingency plans, he realized they were facing a complete breakdown of the security arrangements. The local government had apparently decided to use the peace talks as an opportunity to eliminate rebel leadership. Despite previous agreements guaranteeing safe passage, the communication systems started experiencing interference, making it difficult for Marcus to coordinate with backup forces or even confirm the exact positions of the government troops surrounding them. His team was well trained and equipped, but they were outnumbered and in an increasingly hostile environment. The ambassador's negotiations continued despite the mounting tension, with both sides now fully aware that the situation outside was deteriorating rapidly. The rebel representatives demanded guarantees for their safe departure, while Ambassador Mitchell worked frantically to contact government officials who might be able to defuse the military encirclement. Marcus made the difficult decision to prepare for an emergency extraction, knowing that pulling the ambassador out now would likely end any chance for peace negotiations in the foreseeable future. The mission was failing not because of their security measures, but because of betrayal by the very government they were trying to help establish peace with. As sirens began wailing in the distance and the sound of military vehicles grew closer, Marcus realized they had perhaps minutes before the situation became completely untenable. The carefully planned diplomatic mission was crumbling, and soon it would become a fight for survival rather than a quest for peace. The military vehicles arrived faster than Marcus had anticipated. Through the restaurant's front windows, he could see armed soldiers taking positions behind concrete barriers and abandoned cars. The government forces had completely surrounded the building, turning what should have been a diplomatic venue into a potential battlefield. Ambassador Mitchell's face remained composed as she continued speaking with the rebel leaders, but Marcus could see the concern in her eyes. The rebel representatives were becoming increasingly agitated, with some openly accusing the ambassador of leading them into a trap. The delicate trust that had taken months to build was evaporating in real time. Marcus received fragmented reports through his deteriorating communication system. His backup teams stationed around the city were being detained at government checkpoints. The evacuation routes they had carefully planned were now blocked by military units. Even the embassy was reporting unusual activity, with government officials suddenly becoming unreachable. The restaurant owner, an elderly man who had volunteered his establishment for the peace talks, was visibly terrified. He had been promised protection and compensation for hosting the meeting, but now found his business surrounded by soldiers with weapons drawn. Marcus felt responsible for the man's safety, adding another layer of complexity to an already impossible situation. Outside, military commanders were setting up communication equipment and establishing a command post. This wasn't a spontaneous operation, Marcus realized. The government had planned this ambush carefully, probably from the moment the peace talks were announced. They had used the diplomatic mission as bait to gather rebel leadership in one vulnerable location. The rebel security team, consisting of 6 armed men, was growing increasingly restless. Their leader, a grizzled veteran named Carlos, approached Marcus with barely contained anger. He demanded to know if the security arrangements had been compromised from the beginning, suggesting that the entire diplomatic process was an elaborate ruse designed to eliminate rebel leadership. Ambassador Mitchell tried to maintain control of the situation by continuing the negotiations, hoping that keeping everyone focused on the peace process might prevent the meeting from completely deteriorating. She proposed immediate concrete steps, including prisoner releases and ceasefire agreements, trying to demonstrate the value of diplomatic solutions even as military ones surrounded them. Marcus's team reported that snipers were taking positions on surrounding buildings. The government forces were not just surrounding the restaurant, they were preparing for a siege. This suggested they were willing to risk killing everyone inside, including a respected international diplomat, to eliminate their political opponents. The communication blackout became more complete, as even satellite phones started experiencing interference. Marcus realized that the government was using sophisticated jamming equipment, indicating a level of planning and resources that made their situation even more dire. They were truly isolated, cut off from any outside support or intervention. Inside the restaurant, tension reached a breaking point when one of the younger rebel representatives pulled out a pistol, declaring that he would rather die fighting than be captured. Ambassador Mitchell immediately stepped between him and Marcus's team, using her diplomatic skills to defuse what could have become a deadly confrontation in the confined space. The electricity to the building was cut, plunging the restaurant into darkness except for the emergency lighting and the glow from military floodlights outside. This psychological warfare tactic was clearly designed to increase pressure on everyone inside, making them feel even more trapped and vulnerable. Marcus gathered his team for a quick assessment. They had enough ammunition for a brief firefight, but not for a prolonged siege. The restaurant's construction provided limited protection against military-grade weapons. Most importantly, they had civilians to protect, including the ambassador and the restaurant owner, which severely limited their tactical options. The government forces outside began using loudspeakers to demand the surrender of the rebel representatives, offering safe passage only to the ambassador and her security team. This offer was clearly designed to create division within the restaurant, forcing the Americans to choose between their diplomatic mission and their personal safety. Ambassador Mitchell firmly rejected any arrangement that would abandon the rebel representatives to government forces, knowing that doing so would not only end the peace process but likely result in executions. Her decision to stand with the rebels, even in this desperate situation, impressed even the most skeptical rebel leaders and demonstrated her genuine commitment to finding a peaceful solution. As the siege entered its second hour, Marcus realized that conventional security protocols were completely inadequate for their current situation. The mission had failed not because of poor planning or inadequate resources, but because they had trusted a government that was negotiating in bad faith. Now survival depended on finding solutions that went far beyond standard diplomatic security procedures. Captain Elena Vasquez had been watching the government operation from her position 3 blocks away when she realized something was terribly wrong. As a member of the Royal Guard assigned to provide additional security for high-profile diplomatic missions, she was supposed to maintain a discreet perimeter around the peace talks. But the military units surrounding the restaurant were not following any security protocol. She had been briefed on Elena's Royal Guard. Unit had served as ceremonial protection for visiting dignitaries for years, but they also maintained combat readiness and specialized training in diplomatic security. Unlike regular military forces, the Royal Guard reported directly to the monarchy and maintained independence from government political decisions. This independence was about to become crucial. Through her binoculars, Elena could see that the situation at the restaurant had become a siege rather than a security operation. The government forces were positioned for assault rather than protection, and their communications equipment suggested they were jamming all signals from inside the building. This violated every agreement made regarding the peace talks. Elena's commanding officer had been mysteriously recalled to the capital just hours before the meeting, leaving her as the senior Royal Guard representative in the area. Her orders were clear: ensure the safety of all diplomatic personnel and maintain the neutrality that made peace negotiations possible. But those orders were now in direct conflict with what the government forces were doing. She tried to contact the government military commander through official channels, but was told that the operation was classified and that Royal Guard forces should maintain their distance. This response confirmed Elena's suspicions that the siege was not an authorized security measure, but a deliberate betrayal of the peace process. Elena's team consisted of 12 highly trained Royal Guards, equipped with advanced weapons and communication equipment that operated on different frequencies than regular military forces. More importantly, they had legal authority to intervene in situations where diplomatic neutrality was being violated, even if it meant opposing other government forces. The Royal Guard had historically served as a check on government power, ensuring that international agreements and diplomatic protocols were respected regardless of political changes. Elena's grandfather had served in the same role during previous conflicts, and family stories had taught her that sometimes protecting the monarchy's honor required defying immediate political authority. As Elena watched the siege develop, she realized that Ambassador Mitchell and everyone else in the restaurant would likely be killed if the government forces proceeded with their apparent plan. The rebel leaders would be eliminated, the peace process would die with them, and international confidence in her country's diplomatic commitments would be destroyed. Elena made a decision that would define her career and possibly her life. She contacted her team and explained that they were going to intervene to protect diplomatic neutrality, even though it meant directly opposing government military forces. Her Royal Guards understood the gravity of the situation and agreed to follow her leadership despite the risks. The Royal Guard's equipment included advanced communication systems that could penetrate the jamming being used around the restaurant. Elena managed to establish contact with Marcus's security team inside the building. Learning about the desperate situation and the ambassador's refusal to abandon the rebel representatives, Elena's plan was audacious and dangerous. She would use the Royal Guard's legal authority to demand access to the siege perimeter, claiming a need to verify the safety of diplomatic personnel. Once inside the government cordon, her team would be positioned to provide support for an evacuation that the government forces would not expect. The Royal Guard's ceremonial uniforms and official status initially confused the government commanders, who were unsure how to respond to Elena's demands for access. She used this uncertainty to position her team at strategic locations around the restaurant while appearing to conduct a routine diplomatic security assessment. Elena's communications with Marcus revealed that the people inside the restaurant had been without food or water for hours, and that tensions between different groups were approaching a breaking point. The government's psychological warfare tactics were working, but they were also creating conditions that would make any resolution more difficult. Through careful observation, Elena identified weaknesses in the government's siege positions. Their forces were concentrated on the main approaches, but had left some service areas relatively unguarded. Apparently confident that their overwhelming numbers made detailed tactical positioning unnecessary, Elena contacted the embassy through her independent communication channels. Reporting the true nature of the situation, and requesting immediate international intervention. However, she knew that diplomatic protests would take hours or days to have effect, while the people in the restaurant might not survive that. The Royal Guard's historical role as protectors of diplomatic honor meant that Elena's intervention was not just legally justified but practically required. The monarchy's international reputation depended on maintaining the trust necessary for diplomatic negotiations, and allowing this betrayal to succeed would damage that reputation for generations. As Elena finalized her plan to break the siege, she understood that she was risking court-martial and imprisonment by opposing government forces. But she also knew that her oath to protect diplomatic neutrality and international agreements took precedence over temporary political considerations. The Royal Guard existed precisely for moments when doing the right thing required defying immediate authority. Elena's first move was to approach the government military commander under the pretense of coordinating Royal Guard ceremonial duties with the ongoing operation. Colonel Mendez was clearly uncomfortable with her presence, but couldn't openly refuse cooperation with the Royal Guard without creating an official incident that would draw unwanted attention. She used this meeting to gather intelligence about the government's intentions and timeline. Colonel Mendez revealed, perhaps inadvertently, that they planned to storm the restaurant within 2 hours, claiming that intelligence suggested the rebels were planning to use explosives. Elena knew this was almost certainly a fabrication designed to justify deadly force against everyone inside. While maintaining the appearance of coordination, Elena positioned her royal guards at locations that would allow them to disrupt the government's assault when the time came. She assigned 3 guards to monitor the sniper positions, 4 to cover the main approach routes, and kept 5 with her for direct intervention at the restaurant itself. Elena established secure communication with Marcus inside the restaurant, using encrypted Royal Guard frequencies that the government forces couldn't intercept. She learned that Ambassador Mitchell was becoming increasingly concerned about the restaurant owner, who was showing signs of a heart condition under the extreme stress of the siege. The situation inside the restaurant was deteriorating rapidly. The rebel representatives were arguing among themselves, with some blaming others for walking into what they now saw as an obvious trap. The younger rebels were advocating for a violent breakout attempt, while older leaders still hoped for a negotiated solution. Elena realized she needed to act before the government forces launched their assault, or before internal tensions inside the restaurant led to violence. She developed a complex plan that would require precise timing and significant risk-taking by her entire team. Her plan involved creating multiple diversions to draw government forces away from key positions while simultaneously providing cover for people to escape from the restaurant. The Royal Guard's official status would provide some initial protection, but once shooting started, they would be as vulnerable as anyone else. Elena contacted her most trusted sergeant, Maria Santos, who had served with her for 6 years and understood the importance of their mission. Together, they reviewed the layout of the area and identified 3 possible escape routes that could be secured with careful coordination and significant luck. The Royal Guard had trained for situations where they might need to protect diplomatic personnel from their own government's forces. But those scenarios had always seemed theoretical. Elena was about to test whether their training and equipment were adequate for real-world application against superior numbers. Through her communication with Marcus, Elena learned that Ambassador Mitchell was insisting on including the restaurant owner in any escape plan, refusing to leave behind a civilian who had risked his safety to support the peace process. This decision complicated the logistics but reinforced Elena's determination to succeed. Elena's team began their operation by reporting suspicious activity in areas away from the restaurant, drawing some government forces to investigate false alarms. These diversions were carefully planned to seem legitimate, while reducing the odds against a successful evacuation. The Royal Guard's superior equipment became crucial as they used night vision technology and silenced weapons to neutralize several sniper positions without raising alarm. Elena's training in special operations, usually reserved for protecting visiting royalty, proved valuable in this unconventional application. As Elena's team moved into position for the main operation, she received word that the government forces were advancing their timeline. Colonel Mendez had apparently received orders to storm the restaurant immediately, regardless of diplomatic consequences. The window for successful intervention was closing rapidly. Elena made the difficult decision to accelerate her own timeline, knowing that rushing would increase the chances of failure, but that waiting would guarantee disaster. She gave her team the signal to begin the extraction operation, marking the point where the Royal Guard officially broke with government authority. The first phase involved Elena's guards using smoke grenades and electronic countermeasures to create confusion among the government forces while establishing secure communication with everyone inside the restaurant. The Royal Guard's advanced equipment allowed them to see clearly through the smoke, while their opponents were effectively blinded. Elena personally approached the restaurant's rear entrance, using her Royal Guard identification to demand entry for what she claimed was a diplomatic security assessment. The government soldiers stationed there were confused by her authority and hesitated long enough for her to enter the building. Inside the restaurant, Elena found a scene of barely controlled chaos. Ambassador Mitchell was still trying to maintain diplomatic discussions, but the rebel representatives were preparing weapons, and the restaurant owner was clearly in medical distress. Elena announced that she was there to facilitate an evacuation under Royal Guard protection. The rebels initially suspected that Elena's arrival was part of the government trap, but Marcus's security team vouched for her after confirming her identity and the independence of the Royal Guard. The ambassador immediately recognized the significance of Royal Guard intervention and began preparing for emergency evacuation. Elena explained that her team could provide cover for an escape attempt, but success would require everyone to follow her instructions precisely and move quickly once the operation began. The next few minutes would determine whether diplomatic process could be saved or whether the peace talks would end in bloodshed that would make future negotiations impossible. Elena's evacuation plan required split-second coordination between her Royal Guards outside and the combined security teams inside the restaurant. She divided the evacuees into 3 groups. Ambassador Mitchell with Marcus and 2 guards would take the primary route. The rebel representatives would escape through the kitchen exit, and she would personally escort the restaurant owner through a service corridor that her team had identified. The operation began with Elena's outside guards launching a series of coordinated attacks on government communication equipment. Using specialized electromagnetic pulse devices, they disabled the jamming equipment and disrupted the military's coordination systems. This created a brief window of confusion that Elena needed to exploit. Immediately, smoke grenades deployed by the Royal Guards created dense cover around all sides of the restaurant while simultaneously triggering the government forces gas mask protocols, which would slow their response time. Elena had studied the military's standard procedures and used their own training against them. Inside the restaurant, Elena distributed emergency communication devices to each group leader, allowing them to coordinate movements even if they became separated. The rebel leader Carlos initially resisted taking orders from a government Royal Guard, but Elena's actions had already demonstrated that she was risking everything to help them escape. The restaurant owner, whose name was Fernando, was struggling with chest pains and shortness of breath. Elena quickly assessed that he was likely having a heart attack brought on by the extreme stress of the siege. She administered emergency medication from her first aid kit, while preparing to physically carry him if necessary. Ambassador Mitchell proved herself capable of operating under extreme pressure, helping to coordinate the rebel evacuation while staying in communication with her own security team. Her diplomatic training included crisis management, but nothing had prepared her for escaping from her own government's military forces. Elena's team outside began their most dangerous phase, creating false targets that would draw government fire away from the actual escape routes. Royal Guards used thermal decoys and movement simulators to make it appear that people were escaping from locations where no one was actually present. The government forces fell for the deception initially, concentrating their response on the false targets, while the real evacuees moved through routes that Elena's team had carefully cleared. However, Colonel Mendez quickly realized what was happening and began redirecting his forces to cover all possible escape paths. Elena's group with Fernando encountered their first serious obstacle when government soldiers blocked the service corridor they were using. Elena had to make a quick decision between finding another route, which would take precious time Fernando might not have, or directly confronting the soldiers blocking their path. She chose confrontation. using her Royal Guard authority to order the soldiers to step aside for diplomatic security reasons. When they hesitated, Elena's Sergeant Maria Santos appeared behind them, having circled through the building, and the soldiers found themselves outmaneuvered by Royal Guards who clearly knew the area better than they did. Meanwhile, Marcus's group with Ambassador Mitchell faced a different challenge. Government forces had anticipated the primary escape route and set up an ambush. Marcus had to improvise, leading the ambassador through a partially collapsed section of an adjacent building that provided cover, but was extremely dangerous to navigate. The rebel representatives, led by Carlos, encountered heavy resistance as they attempted to reach their extraction point. Government forces had concentrated significant firepower on the routes they expected rebels to use, forcing Carlos's group to take shelter in a burned-out vehicle while Elena's guards worked to suppress the government positions. Elena coordinated the entire operation through her communication network, while simultaneously providing medical support to Fernando, whose condition was worsening. She had to balance the speed necessary for escape with the care required to keep the restaurant owner alive long enough to reach medical help. The turning point came when Elena made an unprecedented decision. She used the Royal Guard's emergency authority to declare the entire area a diplomatic sanctuary, essentially asserting that the Royal Guard was taking control of the situation to protect international agreements. This legal maneuver was risky and might not hold up under scrutiny, but it created enough confusion to give her operation additional precious minutes. Colonel Mendez attempted to override Elena's authority, leading to a tense confrontation between government military forces and Royal Guards that was broadcast over radio frequencies monitored by international observers. This attention from outside parties began to constrain the government's options for violent resolution. Elena's group successfully reached their first checkpoint, but Fernando collapsed completely, requiring immediate medical attention that Elena couldn't provide with her field equipment. She made the difficult decision to call for emergency medical assistance, knowing that doing so would reveal their location to government forces. The medical evacuation request created a new complication when government forces attempted to intercept the ambulance Elena had summoned. However, Royal Guard authority extended to protecting medical personnel involved in diplomatic operations, giving Elena's team legal justification for escorting the ambulance through government checkpoints. As all three evacuation groups approached their rendezvous point, Elena realized that the most dangerous phase was still ahead. Government forces were regrouping and preparing a final attempt to capture the rebels and potentially arrest Elena's Royal Guard team for insubordination. The escape operation had succeeded in getting everyone out of the immediate trap, but they were not yet truly safe. Elena established communication with international monitoring organizations, informing them of the situation and requesting immediate diplomatic intervention. She knew that once international attention focused on the incident, the government would find it much more difficult to use violent solutions without facing serious political consequences. The rendezvous point Elena had selected was an abandoned warehouse complex where the Royal Guard had previously conducted training exercises. She knew the layout intimately and had positioned supplies there as contingency planning for diplomatic emergencies. However, government forces were now actively hunting all three evacuation groups, making the approach increasingly dangerous. Marcus's group with Ambassador Mitchell reached the warehouse first, but they discovered that government forces had anticipated their destination. Military vehicles were positioned to observe all approaches, forcing them to take shelter in a drainage system that ran beneath the complex. The ambassador's diplomatic training had not prepared her for crawling through underground passages, but she adapted quickly to the harsh realities of their situation. Elena's medical emergency with Fernando complicated everything. The ambulance she had summoned was intercepted by government forces, who claimed authority to examine all medical transports in the operational area. Elena was forced to make another impossible choice: allow Fernando to be taken by government forces who might use him as leverage, or attempt medical treatment herself with inadequate equipment and training. She chose to keep Fernando with her group while requesting emergency medical consultation over her secure communication system. A Royal Guard medic stationed at the embassy provided remote guidance as Elena administered advanced first aid. But Fernando's condition remained critical, and required hospital treatment they couldn't provide. Carlos's rebel group encountered the most resistance during their approach to the warehouse. Government forces had deployed additional units specifically to capture rebel leadership, and the streets around the rendezvous point were effectively under military control. Carlos made the tactical decision to split his group, sending younger rebels to create diversions while the senior leadership attempted to reach Elena's position. The international attention Elena had solicited began producing results. Foreign diplomatic offices were demanding explanations for the military action around the peace talks, and international news organizations were reporting on the siege. The government found itself under increasing pressure to explain why diplomatic negotiations had become a military operation. Elena used this international pressure strategically, communicating with foreign diplomatic representatives and providing them with real-time information about the situation. Each report increased the political cost of violent government action, while potentially providing protective oversight for her rescue operation. Colonel Mendez received new orders that reflected the government's changing position. With international attention focused on the incident, direct military action against diplomatic personnel had become politically impossible. However, the government still wanted to capture rebel leadership and was willing to pursue them aggressively while claiming to protect diplomatic personnel. This change in government priorities created new opportunities for Elena's operation. She negotiated a temporary ceasefire agreement that would allow medical evacuation for Fernando, while establishing a diplomatic immunity zone around Ambassador Mitchell's position. The government agreed to these limited measures to avoid further international criticism. Elena's royal guards had proven their worth throughout the operation, but they were now facing potential court-martial for insubordination and unauthorized action against government forces. Elena took full responsibility for the operation, making it clear that her team had followed her orders rather than acting independently. The evacuation of Fernando provided an unexpected opportunity for intelligence gathering. Elena's medics, while treating him in the ambulance, learned that he had overhead conversations between government officials that proved the siege was planned in advance and designed to eliminate rebel leadership regardless of diplomatic consequences. This intelligence gave Elena leverage to negotiate broader protections for everyone involved in the peace talks. She presented the evidence to international observers, demonstrating that the government had systematically betrayed diplomatic agreements and endangered international representatives. Ambassador Mitchell's position in the drainage system became untenable when rising water levels, caused by a rainstorm, threatened to flood their hiding place. Marcus had to improvise an emergency evacuation that brought them closer to government forces but provided access to higher ground and better defensive positions. Carlos's diversionary tactics succeeded in drawing government attention away from the main rendezvous point, but at significant cost. 2 of his younger fighters were captured, and others were wounded in the running battle with government forces. Carlos was forced to make another difficult decision about whether to attempt rescue of his captured comrades or focus on reaching safety for the senior leadership. Elena coordinated between all groups while maintaining communication with international observers who were demanding access to the situation. She realized that the rescue operation had evolved into something much larger, a test of whether international diplomatic agreements could be enforced when governments decided to ignore them. The Royal Guard's historical role as protectors of international commitments was being tested in ways that had never been anticipated. Elena's decision to intervene had saved lives and protected diplomatic personnel, but it had also created a constitutional crisis regarding the relationship between Royal Guard authority and government political decisions. As night approached, Elena prepared for the final phase of the operation, getting everyone to actual safety rather than temporary shelter. Government forces were regrouping for what appeared to be a final attempt to capture the rebels, while international pressure was mounting for a peaceful resolution that would protect all parties involved in the originally planned peace negotiations. Elena's final gambit required her to leverage every aspect of the Royal Guard's unique position within the country's power structure. She contacted the monarchy directly, bypassing all government officials, and requested immediate royal intervention to protect diplomatic commitments that bore the crown's authority. This unprecedented step would either save everyone involved or end her career permanently. The royal response came within hours. The monarch issued a direct decree establishing royal protection for all participants in the peace negotiations and ordering government forces to withdraw from the area. This intervention transformed the situation from a military operation into a constitutional confrontation between different branches of government authority. Colonel Mendez found himself in an impossible position. Government officials ordered him to continue operations against rebel leadership, while royal authority commanded him to withdraw and allow diplomatic processes to resume. The military chain of command had no provisions for resolving conflicts between these competing authorities. Elena used this confusion to coordinate the final evacuation of all groups to the royal estate outside the capital, where diplomatic immunity could be maintained indefinitely if necessary. The royal guard's ceremonial duties included protecting the estate, giving Elena legal authority to provide sanctuary for diplomatic personnel and their associates. Ambassador Mitchell's extraction from the drainage system became a carefully orchestrated operation involving international diplomatic vehicles provided by allied embassies. The government could not interfere with official diplomatic transport without creating international incidents with multiple countries simultaneously. Carlos's rebel group faced the most dangerous extraction, as government forces were still actively hunting them despite royal orders. Elena coordinated with international human rights observers to provide protective escort, effectively internationalizing the rebels' safety and making their capture a matter of global diplomatic concern. Fernando's medical situation stabilized after his transfer to a hospital with international medical staff, removing the immediate life-threatening crisis while providing him with protective custody that prevented government interference. His testimony about the planned ambush became crucial evidence for international investigators. The peace talks resumed 3 days later under international supervision at a neutral embassy compound. The government's betrayal of the original negotiations had backfired completely, resulting in much stronger international oversight and reduced government control over the diplomatic process. Elena faced a military tribunal for insubordination, but international diplomatic pressure and royal support transformed the proceedings into a review of royal guard procedures rather than a punishment for unauthorized action. Her intervention was ultimately classified as appropriate execution of royal guard duties to protect diplomatic commitments. The incident established new precedents for royal guard authority in diplomatic situations and created international protocols for protecting peace negotiations from government interference. Elena's actions had not only saved lives but had strengthened institutional protections for future diplomatic efforts. Ambassador Mitchell's report to her government praised the Royal Guard's intervention and recommended increased international coordination with constitutional monarchy institutions that could provide checks on government power during sensitive negotiations. The failed mission had inadvertently created stronger frameworks for diplomatic protection. Carlos and the rebel leadership used their international visibility to advance peace negotiations with greater success than had seemed possible before the crisis. The government's attempted betrayal had actually strengthened the rebels' negotiating position by demonstrating their commitment to peaceful solutions even under extreme duress. The restaurant owner Fernando became an unexpected advocate for peace after his recovery, using his experience to encourage other civilians to support diplomatic solutions rather than military ones. His near-death experience during the siege made him a powerful voice for the costs of choosing violence over negotiation. Elena received recognition from international diplomatic organizations for her role in protecting diplomatic personnel and processes. The Royal Guard was invited to provide security consultation for peace negotiations in other countries, expanding their traditional ceremonial role into active diplomatic protection. The constitutional crisis created by competing government and royal authorities was resolved through new agreements that clarified Royal Guard independence in matters involving international commitments. Elena's intervention had not only saved a specific mission, but had strengthened institutional protections for future diplomatic work. 6 months later, a comprehensive peace agreement was signed between the government and rebel groups, with ceremonies conducted under Royal Guard protection at the same estate where Elena had provided sanctuary during the crisis. The failed mission had ultimately succeeded by demonstrating that institutional protections for diplomatic processes were stronger than any single government's political calculations. Elena continued serving in the Royal Guard with expanded responsibilities for diplomatic security, but she never forgot that her most important mission had required her to break the rules rather than follow them. Sometimes protecting institutions meant defying immediate authority to preserve the principles those institutions were designed to serve.